Hello and welcome to the video. This is a video to answer the question from this viewer here. He was asking about any tips, tricks or methods I use to keep everything neat and tidy, specifically when you're building a wing or a plane. Now, in the early days of the hobby, I absolutely didn't go through all of these particular steps. I took the easiest route, which meant that the inside of my model looks like an absolute rat's nest. But after many years of flying, I realized that not only causes issues with the builds, with potentially crosstalk and signals jumping from one cable to the other, acting like antennas, but also it makes it incredibly difficult to troubleshoot and also impedes airflow in chassis that are a bit tight and where you want a bit of airflow to keep components cool. So I'm making this video to go through the way that I do it these days. And some of the builds you're going to see on the channel are super neat. Some of them are less neat, and it depends on the amount of time that I've got. But when I want a model to be something that I'm going to fly for a long time, I try and do all these things to make sure it looks nice and works really well and is easy to repair and stay on top of. The first thing that I'd recommend you do is when you are starting to build, before you start cutting cables and doing anything else, is once you have it all flashed and set up on the bench, and that's the way that I tend to do it here. I'll install the flight controller and the receiver and the GPS, just make sure it all works, and then I know if it doesn't work after I've installed it into the model, it's because I've installed something wrong. Once I'm moving it into the model, I will position everything first and take a little bit of time on this to figure out what the actual cable lengths are going to be. I can actually see very quickly how much spare cable I'm going to have on things like the receiver and the GPS, and whether they're going to be too long or not long enough. It's easy also for me to spot the routes of where cables are going to run, things like power cables being kept away from signal cables, more on that in a minute, and other things too. And finally, think about separating your antennas. I always try and keep my radio antennas, GPS, and also the FPV antennas as far away as physically possible. Only a handful of inches is usually enough if you're not using silly powers with stuff, but I tend to try and separate them as much as I can just to make it as clean as possible, and again, to keep things operating in the best possible way. Once I have everything laid out and I know what the cable lengths need to be, I will cut the cables to length and crimp new ends on, particularly things like servo cables. Obviously it's going to be a flight controller and there's loads of extra cable and it's something that you soldered on. I'll unsolder it, snip off the extra couple of inches, and then resolder it back on. Always leave a little bit of slack would be my recommendation. Half an inch, 12, 15 millimeters. It's always handy having that little bit of slack. Why? Well, if wires are too tight, as vibration happens on the model, that'll eventually weaken, stress, and crack things like solder joints. But also it transmits vibration into things like flight controllers and stabilizers if wires are too taut. And it also gives you the ability, if an end does break or you need to make the end off again, you have that little bit of wiggle room. It might be that you've swapped the transmit and receive pins accidentally. You might need a little bit more give in order to set that right. Just giving you that extra little bit of slack does give you the wiggle room. If I do need to extend a wire with something else, I will normally try and replace the entire wire rather than have multiple soldering points throughout it. However, if that isn't feasible, or it's just one wire and it's already got the specialized ends on it for, the little connectors onto flight controllers and into HDFPV units, I will just solder them together and cover them with a bit of heat shrink. But I'm not afraid to use connectors where I need them to. I tend to, for example, like to have things like my HDFPV system connected via a standard servo cable for the transmit and receive pins. Allows me to just turn it upside down and plug it back in, and that can fix a wiring issue. But also to have things and make off ends with things like the GST power connectors, as that makes things super easy too. Third tip is that I always try and route signal cables together. If I have all the cables coming in for the different servos into a flight controller or a receiver, then I will take a moment just to make sure they're not twisted, that they're nice and neat before they're put into place, and then I will pop a cable tie around them once every 2 to 4 inches depending on the size of the model, just to keep everything super neat and to keep things out the way. And personally, I like to make sure that things like, all the signal wires you can see at the top, etc., making sure that things aren't twisted are going to take up a lot less room and look a lot better. And finally, my big tip is when you are doing this stuff, and I talked about it in the first tip, is separate the power and signal wires. Don't run them side by side, particularly if they're running for decent lengths along the battery bay to the nose of the model where you've got your FPV stuff. You will find that high current power wires will give off quite a lot of electromagnetic interference and can actually introduce signals into those cables that are close by. So a good habit to get into is whenever you're doing this is kind of designate one side of the model for the power wires and the other side for things like the signal. So an example recently that I did, things like the Sparrow V2 Pro stabilizer that I set up, that's the exact way I did it. I ran the power cables to the HT system in the nose down one side of the chassis, and the signal went on the other side. Just keeps everything super clean. And the last tip is when you run those longer cables, don't be afraid to run a little seam of hot glue and just press those cables in. Just stops them flapping around. Again, make sure that you are leaving enough strain relief at either end, but it just keeps everything neat and keeps all the wires in place. So hopefully that is going to help with some of the ideas when you are doing your builds. Again, everyone has their own way of doing this and their particular way that they like to go about it. But I find laying everything out, clipping and cutting all the cables to length, making the ends off, and then tidying it up when everything's been installed with a couple of zip ties and the odd little bead of hot glue makes everything look really nice and makes it very easy to see where wires are running if you need to troubleshoot a problem. Thank you for watching my video. Check out the playlist, and adding Pedantry 360 to your search terms will help you find my content. If you haven't done so already, please hit the like and subscribe button. It helps a lot. You can support the time I spend here answering questions and helping others by using the links in the video description.